Hey friends, tonight we're digging into something deceptively simple, painfully real, and historically forgotten: boots. Not just any boots, Napoleon's boots. The stiff, unforgiving leather that helped build an empire, and maybe helped destroy it too. We'll uncover the design flaw so basic it destroyed thousands of lives. How entire armies limped to defeat, not from bullets, but from blisters. And why modern doctors would scream if they saw what 19th century feet endured. We'll meet reenactors who tried wearing these boots today and couldn't make it to lunchtime without bleeding. And when we finally reach the snow-covered roads of Russia, that's when things get truly gruesome. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket. And if you've ever complained about tight shoes, trust me, you haven't felt anything yet. Stay with me until the end, because by the time we get there, you'll never look at a pair of boots the same way again. Step by step, the army advanced, a living, breathing tide of determined souls, overcoming the oppressive chill and damp that clung to every inch of the rugged terrain. The heavy thuds of countless boots on compacted earth formed a rhythmic cadence, as though the very heartbeat of an empire pulsed in the collective march. Even before the eye could catch the first glimpses of the soldiers' faces, the atmosphere was saturated with sensations. The creak of tough, well-worn leather that guarded their feet against nature's indifferent brutality. The strain in every step. The subtle groan of fatigued muscles, echoing the silent toll of responsibility. And a pervasive, almost tactile odor, the mingled aroma of damp fabric and cold, unyielding weather that enveloped the company like an unwelcome cloak. In this great procession, the soldiers were bound not merely by orders, but by a shared endurance, a unity in suffering that transcended individual discomfort. The very question arose, whispered among the ranks in the quiet moments between the relentless clamor of marching. What was it that they wore on their feet, and why had it become such a burden? The answer, hidden beneath layers of outdated technology and uncompromising tradition, lay not only in the cold practicality of military equipment, but in a centuries-old custom that dictated every detail of uniform production. As the army journeyed, each footfall was a testament to an era in which comfort had been sacrificed at the altar of uniformity and expediency. The soldier's footwear, rigid and unaccommodating, was a symbol of a broader doctrine, a doctrine that prioritized the efficiency of mass production over the well-being of the individual. Their boots, crafted in workshops that churned out endless rows of nearly identical pairs, epitomized the cold logic of an established military system. In those days, the idea of personal adaptation or custom fit was unheard of. Instead, a single, unyielding design was imposed upon every soldier, regardless of the unique contours of their own feet. This insistence on standardization served a dual purpose. It not only streamlined the process of outfitting an enormous fighting force, but also turned the painful experience of wearing such boots into a mark of honor, a visible reminder of each individual sacrifice on behalf of a grand, unyielding cause. As the march continued, the relentless clatter of hardened leather and the occasional sharp snap of a buckle punctuated the quiet suffering. Every step evoked images of sprawling workshops filled with tired craftsmen, whose hands, though skilled, were bound by the constraints of mass production and centuries-old military regulations. The materials at hand, a coarse, durable leather sourced from distant tanneries, heavy soles designed more for durability than for comfort, and metal fixtures that provided little more than a basic measure of support, told a story of compromise. In a time when the rapid assembly of troops took precedence over individual comfort, the trade-off was clear: efficiency at the expense of ergonomics. Each boot was a product of its era. imbued with the notion that the rigors of war justified even the harshest physical tolls on the body. The march itself was a fluid saga, a continuous progression that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between one moment and the next. Under the muted, almost hypnotic cadence of countless footsteps, the soldiers' collective spirit became palpable. In the soft interplay of shadow and light, among the irregular contours of weathered faces and determined eyes, lay an unspoken understanding. Every foot, secured in its poorly fashioned boot, carried not just flesh and bone, but the weight of ambition, duty, and the lingering echoes of past glories. They moved together as a single entity, an unstoppable force propelled by sheer will and the unyielding rhythm of their shared burdens. The harsh reality of these boots was not lost on any of them. Behind every stiff, unyielding surface lay a hidden narrative of discomfort, a quiet chronicle written in blisters, bruises, and silent endurance. Every mile traversed across muddy fields and broken roads extended this narrative, etching deeper lines of fatigue and determination into the very souls of those who marched. And yet, in the face of such relentless adversity, there was an undeniable, almost heroic quality to their perseverance. The unbearable became routine, the painful a badge of honor. In an age when the rigors of the battlefield were measured not just in victories or defeats, but in the sheer physical toll exacted on the human body, the soldiers marched on with a stoic resignation and an unspoken pride in their suffering. It was as if time itself slowed down in those moments, each step stretching into an eternity, each gasp of cold air a reminder of the vast, indifferent expanse that lay before them. The boots, clunky and unyielding, served as both the literal and figurative foundation upon which this great military endeavor was built. They were not designed for the comforts of modern engineering. Instead, they carried the weight of an entire system of thought, a cultural paradigm in which the collective might of an army was measured in unyielding uniformity and enduring resolve. With every crunch of gravel and every step over uneven terrain, a story unfolded, a story of sacrifice, discipline, and the profound cost of tradition. In the midst of this relentless progression, the query that had once been a faint murmur among the ranks grew louder in the minds of the weary soldiers. What was the true purpose behind these remarkably ill-suited boots? Were they merely relics of archaic methods, or did they serve as a silent testament to the philosophy of an empire that valued uniformity over individual ease? This reflective question sparked a hidden dialogue within the collective consciousness of the marchers, an inquiry into whether the means of their physical suffering might also embody a deeper, more enduring message about the nature of duty, sacrifice, and the unyielding demands of military life. The answer, as elusive as it was profound, lay in the intricate interplay between necessity and ideology. Every element of the boot, the rough texture of the leather, the rigid structure of the sole, the metallic fixtures that held it together, was a manifestation of a system that had long since divorced practicality from personal comfort. The philosophy of the day had little room for the luxury of individual tailoring or the nuanced science of ergonomic design. Instead, it embraced an austere vision of military readiness, one in which the uniform was not merely a piece of equipment, but a symbol of an unbending commitment to the collective whole. Thus, the boots became a microcosm of a broader societal paradigm, one in which personal discomfort was not only tolerated but valorized as evidence of a soldier's fortitude. As the rumble of thousands of resolute footsteps merged with the ambient sounds of nature, a distant bird call here, a whisper of wind there, the soldiers moved ever onward. The visual tableau was one of stark contrasts. The earthy hues of mud and leather clashed with the pale light of a breaking dawn, while the determined expressions of the marchers bore silent witness to an inner strength forged through hardship. The road ahead was uncertain, the challenges manifold, Yet every worn boot carried with it the quiet assurance that each step, no matter how arduous, was a step towards something greater, a future defined not by ease but by the resolute pursuit of an ideal. In that dim light of early morning, as the cold crept steadily up their legs, and the solidity of every boot resonated with the unyielding march of destiny, an unmistakable truth emerged. The Army's journey was much more than a mere physical progression from one point to another. It was an epic in motion, a living narrative in which each soldier's suffering contributed to a shared legacy. And in the persistent, unchanging nature of their boots lay a paradox, a seemingly cruel design that nonetheless bolstered the unbreakable bond between each soldier and the grand enterprise to which they had devoted their lives. The boots were never a matter of choice. For the men who marched beneath Napoleon's banners, they weren't articles of clothing. They were assignments, standardized like rifle calibers or uniform buttons. Each pair delivered not to fit, but to comply. These boots were the physical embodiment of a military doctrine that prized unity over comfort, symmetry over health, and uniformity over sense. In this world, a soldier's suffering wasn't an accident, it was part of the system. There was no asking for another size, no appeals to a quartermaster. The notion that a pair of boots might be replaced because they rubbed raw the skin or bent the foot unnaturally was unthinkable. The system wasn't built for dialogue. It was built to feed flesh into a machine, and every cog, every part, no matter how human, was expected to grind along without pause. The military of that era didn't operate with the individual in mind. Its blueprint was geometric, efficient, impersonal. From the moment a young man received his uniform, his boots were no more personal than his musket. They were issued, not chosen. Two stiff, identical cylinders of leather, cut without regard for foot shape or gait, handed out in mass in crowded depots and storage yards. There was no distinction between left or right. The boots were mirrors of each other, waiting to be broken in, not by slow wear at home, but through hours of grueling marches over rough terrain, where every mile dug a little deeper into the skin, the bone, the morale. It wasn't cruelty in the modern sense. No officer handed out these boots with the intent to harm, but it was cruelty in system form, a quiet, bureaucratic kind, born not from malice, but from indifference. The state needed bodies in motion. Boots were a tool. If they caused pain, then pain became part of the process. If they drew blood, then blood became an expected sacrifice. There were no injury reports filed for aching feet, no compensation for limping through mud. You walked, or you fell behind. You endured, or you disappeared. This was the logic of empire, that one man's discomfort was irrelevant in the face of progress. Pain, when shared by all, lost its urgency. If everyone's feet blistered, then blisters became normal. If everyone limped, then the army simply moved slower. Suffering, in this system, was just background noise. To the command above, it was logistics, a matter of scale. You cannot equip 500,000 men with custom footwear. You cannot afford to care whether someone's ankle swells or toes go numb when your maps stretch from Madrid to Moscow. Boots were ordered in batches, manufactured under pressure, shipped in crates, and stacked for inspection like cannonballs or powder kegs. To question their quality was to question the very structure of the machine, and so no one did. The result was a vast walking engine of men, each one reduced at the feet to a set of blunt instruments, shoes that didn't follow the foot but forced it to follow them. Marches became a contest not only of strength or courage, but of foot shape and skin tolerance. The ones who held out longest weren't always the bravest or strongest. They were simply the ones whose bodies aligned, by luck or genetics, with the brutal design of a state-issued boot. And for those whose bones didn't match the mold, there was only silence. They limped behind. They stuffed straw into the toes. They tore strips from their own shirts to soften the inside edges. They waited until the leather relaxed, or until they did. Pain was never voiced, only absorbed, until it no longer needed to be named. In this system, a soldier's identity wasn't individual. He wasn't Alexandre or Jean-Baptiste or Marcel anymore. He was a number, a regiment, a rank. He was his musket and pack weight, his rations and his orders. And his boots, those instruments of quiet torment, were just another standard-issue symbol of how far the system would go to blur the man into the mass. There's a tragic dignity in that silence, a grim kind of loyalty that grows when there's no other option. You don't complain, you don't resist. You pull the boots on, grit your teeth, and walk. Not because it's noble, but because that's what's required. Because if you stop to question the logic, the discomfort, the indifference, you might never start moving again.
So they didn't. They marched. Through puddles and snow, dust and clay, the boots creaked and cracked and bled into the skin. And not once did anyone ask, "Can I have a different pair?" Because in Napoleon's army, the answer was already built into the design. No. In the 18th century, shoes were not shaped to follow the human foot. They expected the foot to conform to them. There was no such thing as a left or right shoe in the way we understand it today. Instead, both shoes were made on the same straight last, mirror images of a single, indifferent design. When a man put on a pair of shoes, he wasn't slipping into something that embraced his form. He was forcing himself into a mold that had no interest in his comfort. And that was perfectly ordinary. The footwear of that era was an extension of its philosophy, pragmatic, hierarchical, and indifferent to the needs of the body. In a world where most people walked, labored, and fought without expectation of ease, discomfort was not a flaw. It was a fact of life. A shoe wasn't meant to cushion your step or support your arch. It was meant to cover your foot, shield it from the worst of the elements, and last as long as the stitching could hold. That was the extent of its ambition. The material most commonly used was leather, thick, raw, unsoftened by modern processes. It came from cows or horses, sometimes stiff enough to stand on its own before being worked. The tanning process was crude by today's standards, often leaving the leather stiff and unforgiving. So when a pair of shoes was handed to a soldier or a laborer, it came with an unspoken understanding. These will hurt. At first, they will chafe and pinch and resist. But with time, your feet will shape them, or they will shape your feet. Shoes weren't crafted for speed or silence. They thudded, they scraped, they left blisters in their wake. Nails were often hammered into the soles to reinforce them, creating a hard surface that protected the foot, but also made each step louder and more jarring. The soles themselves were flat, with no curvature, no arch, no variation. It was like walking on 2 blocks of seasoned wood bound tightly to your flesh.
And yet, no one complained. Not because people enjoyed the pain, but because there was nothing else. The idea of ergonomic footwear didn't exist. No cobbler advertised comfort. No soldier asked if the boots were good for marching. In towns and cities, tradesmen wore shoes built the same way, straight, rigid, impersonal. For the rich, shoes might be finer, softer, made with care and polish, but even then, they prioritized appearance over anatomy. The concept of comfort as a value in design was simply absent from the mental map of the era. It wasn't laziness or cruelty that kept things this way. It was context. The tools to measure, mold, and mass-produce anatomically correct shoes simply didn't exist. And more than that, there was no pressure to create them. People accepted discomfort as a consequence of necessity. A shoe wasn't expected to serve the individual. It served the system, the trade, the army. You wore it, endured it, and adapted. Children grew into shoes that were too big. Adults wore shoes until the seams split, and then patched them, stitched them, passed them on. A pair of shoes was not a disposable object. It was a long-term relationship. And in that relationship, your comfort was the least important factor. This was the world that produced the boots of Napoleon's army. Not a deviation from the norm, but a natural continuation of a centuries-old tradition. A tradition where the human foot was not the focus of design, but the obstacle it had to overcome. So when soldiers laced up for a campaign, they weren't shocked by the stiffness, the pain, the lack of support. They expected it. They'd known nothing else. The 18th century didn't view comfort as weakness, but it didn't view it as necessary either. To be sore, to be bruised, to bear the quiet punishment of each step, that was simply life. Shoes weren't made to cradle, they were made to endure. In the immense machinery of Napoleonic warfare, individual needs dissolved into logistical equations. When you're outfitting an army not of hundreds, but of hundreds of thousands, the question isn't what fits best, but what can be made fast, cheap, and the same. And so, the boot, crude, uniform, unyielding, was born not out of tradition alone, but of sheer necessity. It was one boot for all, not by accident, but by brutal efficiency. Standardization wasn't just a choice. It was survival for a military force stretched across continents. Every soldier needed to be clothed, armed, and shod. And the quickest way to get there was to eliminate variation. You couldn't afford to measure feet or adjust for gait. There were no custom lasts, no tailoring for insteps or heel width. What existed instead was the principle of one form fits all, a form that didn't truly fit anyone. The boot became a symbol of this logic. It wasn't crafted for the man, but for the movement. The pattern was fixed, the materials coarse, the construction rough. They were made in bulk, shaped on straight lasts, and hammered together by the thousands in workshops where speed overtook skill. The faster a pair could be finished, the sooner another soldier could be sent to the front. In the imperial supply chains, the boot had no name, only a number. Tally marks on crates. Pairs lined wall to wall, indistinguishable in size and silhouette. Distribution wasn't based on measurement, but on approximation. A soldier didn't receive what fit, he received what remained. If the pair was too big, he stuffed it with straw. If too small, he bled quietly. If mismatched, he limped, and still he marched. This wasn't viewed as negligence, it was considered practical genius. Fewer patterns meant faster output. Uniform sizes meant boots could be transported, stored, and replaced with mechanical ease. If one boot wore through, another could take its place, regardless of whose it had been. The man became secondary to the object. He adapted or he faltered. And it wasn't just boots. The same logic applied across the uniform. Coats cut to a single model, straps built without variation, packs distributed in rigid bulk. The French army, like many of its time, wasn't designed around the soldier. It was designed around the idea of the soldier, a theoretical unit of manpower, interchangeable and predictable. But it was in the boots that this philosophy hit the ground, literally, because no other piece of the uniform bore so much strain nor inflicted so much suffering as what touched the earth. When a man walked 30 miles in a day, he didn't feel his belt. He felt the leather biting his ankles, the blister opening across his heel, the bone grinding beneath a sole that never meant to bend. Still, the boots kept coming. Row after row of them, black and stiff and identical. They were not garments, they were equipment, issued like a cartridge or a bayonet. If they wore down, they were patched. If they failed, they were replaced, but never reconsidered. The model had been chosen, and the model held. And what emerged was a peculiar kind of silence, not one born of acceptance, but of resignation. Soldiers didn't expect better. They didn't petition for change.
They tightened the laces, clenched their jaws, and adjusted their steps. Because that's what the system demanded. Not comfort, not dialogue, but obedience. You walked in what you were given. You became, quite literally, shaped by it. So the boot, that symbol of imperial might, was less a piece of clothing than a message. You are not here to be served. You are here to serve. And the sooner your body understands that, the sooner you become a functioning part of the machine. The boots that carried Napoleon's soldiers across Europe were not marvels of engineering. They were blunt instruments, hastily assembled from materials that prioritized volume over resilience, simplicity over sophistication. In their construction lay a deep tension between durability and disposability, because while the boots were meant to last, everyone knew they wouldn't, not really. At their core, the boots were built from leather, thick, raw, and barely processed. This wasn't the supple, treated leather of modern craftsmanship. It was coarse and stiff, with a grain so tight it often resisted bending even after weeks of use. Most of it came from cowhide, though occasionally horsehide was used, which offered slightly better resilience but little improvement in comfort. The tanning process was primitive, relying on vegetable-based solutions that left the leather tough and fibrous, almost bark-like in its early stage. When new, the boots could stand upright on their own. When worn, they bent only under protest. The upper part of the boot, the shaft, was made from long, unlined strips of this leather, sewn with thick stitching that rarely followed a perfect line. These shafts extended high above the ankle, meant to protect the leg from brush, mud, and even saber grazes. But their rigidity also meant they rubbed mercilessly against the skin, causing raw abrasions that no amount of linen wrapping could truly prevent. Without any inner lining or cushioning, the leather sat directly against the flesh, absorbing sweat but offering no mercy. The soles told another story. They were constructed from stacked layers of leather, dense, compressed, and nailed together with iron tacks. Unlike modern soles that flex with the foot's movement, these acted more like planks, flat, hard, and indifferent to terrain. The front and heel were often reinforced with hobnails, small iron studs hammered into the bottom to delay wear. These added durability, but also weight and noise. With every step, a soldier left behind a metallic clack, a kind of echo that signaled both presence and impending fatigue. The fastening was rudimentary. Many of the boots lacked laces entirely. Instead, they were designed to be pulled on and off with force, which made for an awkward fit at best. Some had simple leather flaps or loops stitched near the top to help tug them into place. Others were tightened with straps that circled the calf like a belt. The closures were crude, relying more on tension than finesse. The result was rarely snug. Too loose, and the boot slipped and chafed. Too tight, and it constricted blood flow. Dangerous in cold climates where circulation meant survival. Iron played its part not just in hobnails, but occasionally in the construction itself. Some models featured metal shanks embedded in the heel to prevent collapse. Others had small plates inserted for reinforcement. But this metal came at a cost. It added weight, significant weight, when multiplied by distance and mud, and it conducted cold. In winter, the boots didn't insulate, they froze. The iron chilled with the ground, turning each step into a sting. No matter how thick the wool socks, the cold crept in from beneath. And then there were the weaknesses. For all their severity, these boots broke fast. The stitching often split at the seams, especially where the sole met the upper. The leather, dry and untreated, cracked under repeated flexing, especially in wet conditions. Once soaked, the boots took days to dry, and when they did, they stiffened again, shrinking and warping into new, sharper forms. After that, they no longer fit even as badly as before. They became their own kind of enemy. Grit and grime only made things worse. Marching through mud, gravel, and snow forced the leather to stretch, buckle, and rot.
Small stones worked their way between the sole layers, loosening nails. Moisture caused rust. Frost turned stiffness into brittleness. And with every step, the material degraded, sometimes visibly, sometimes invisibly, until the boot gave way mid-march and the soldier was left limping, bleeding, or worse. Yet there was no alternate material. No rubber, no synthetic fibers, no waterproofing agents. The science of footwear was, at that time, an exercise in compromise. You made a boot hard enough to survive a week, but soft enough that a man could break it in before it broke him. Most boots failed that equation. They were not beautiful. They were not clever. They were not designed to last a lifetime or even a season. They were cobbled together by speed, dictated by numbers, and handed out without consideration for terrain or climate. The boot was not a solution. It was a symbol, a marker of what the system believed a soldier could endure. And in that belief, the materials were honest, raw, unforgiving, and always ready to fail. The process of making a Napoleonic-era boot was not guided by comfort, but by speed, repetition, and raw endurance. Shoemaking in this context was stripped to its most functional core. A craft once delicate and intimate turned into a form of wartime manufacturing. The workshop was no place for refinement. It was a forge of necessity, where the goal wasn't elegance or innovation, but quantity. Inside these crowded workshops, often dim, loud, and soaked with the tang of leather and tallow, men hunched over heavy benches, shaping hide with crude knives and wooden mallets. Their tools were simple: awls to pierce holes, needles thick enough to drag coarse thread through wet leather, hammers to flatten seams, and metal lasts, those rigid foot-shaped molds around which the boot took form. But these lasts were few in number, reused endlessly, and more often resembled a geometric idea of a foot than an actual human one. They didn't bend, adjust, or vary in width. They came in limited sizes, and no difference existed between left and right. Every pair was symmetrical, impersonal, standardized. The leather, harsh and stubborn, was soaked to make it marginally pliable. It was then stretched over the last, beaten into submission with blunt instruments, and stitched by hand with waxed thread. There were no soft linings, no paddings. The edges were raw, the inner seams exposed. Stitching was often rushed, leading to uneven tension and fragile joins that would split under pressure. The entire process was a battle not just between man and material, but between speed and sustainability. There was no cushioning system, no shock absorption. The concept of a sole that compressed under pressure or returned energy with each step hadn't even entered the realm of imagination. The soldier's boots struck the ground like blocks of dried clay. The feet inside bore the full brunt of every impact. There were no arch supports, no contoured insoles, no heel cups. If a soldier had high arches, flat feet, or any anatomical irregularity at all, the boot didn't adjust. The foot simply suffered. Adaptation was left to the body. It was expected that the skin would toughen, that bones would adjust, that pain would eventually fade into dullness. This was not a failure of technique in the eyes of the time. It was a reflection of the prevailing belief that the body's purpose was to endure. If a boot wore into your heel, you wrapped your foot tighter. If it scraped your ankle raw, you ignored the blood. The shoemaker's task was to build a barrier between flesh and the elements, not to mold comfort around the human form. Even the most skilled cordwainers, those trained in the art of civilian shoemaking, were constrained by the expectations of war. They knew how to craft a finely tuned pair of shoes for the wealthy, but when contracted by the army, they were forced to work differently. Quotas mattered more than finesse. Detail was sacrificed at the altar of demand. Boots were measured not in quantity, but in crates. Precision gave way to pace. And the result was always the same:
a heavy, unyielding product that seemed almost designed to resist the man who wore it. There was no learning curve in the design, no evolution from one campaign to the next. The boots of Italy looked like the boots of Austria, which resembled those worn on the frigid roads to Moscow. Climate, terrain, distance, none of these things inspired change. The model was fixed. Its faults, baked into its very pattern, were passed from soldier to soldier, factory to factory, without resistance. In hindsight, this technological stagnation seems remarkable. But at the time, it was simply how things were. War did not prioritize biomechanics. It prioritized uniformity and repeatability. And so, comfort became a luxury outside the bounds of military thought. No one studied how the boot altered a soldier's stride. No one wondered how the lack of flex at the ankle might damage the knees or spine. The boot was not questioned because it was never considered capable of improvement. It was a tool, and the tool worked as long as the man didn't break before the leather did. So the process continued. Leather soaked and stretched, soles nailed and stitched, pairs lined up on wooden racks, identical to each other, identical to the ones before. Each pair a silent testimony to the era's deepest truth, that pain, when standardized, ceased to be an exception. It simply became part of the uniform. The boots didn't bend. That was their defining trait, their stubborn, immovable silhouette. Each step taken in them was less a motion and more a negotiation between flesh and leather. The boot, as constructed, resisted flexion with every fiber. It didn't respond to the natural rhythm of walking. It interrupted it. The human foot, with its intricate arch, its rolling heel-to-toe motion, its delicate balance of muscles and bones, none of that mattered. The boot imposed its own geometry, and it was merciless. At the core of the problem was the sole. Made of thick, hardened layers of leather, reinforced with hobnails and sometimes stitched directly into a flat, unyielding midsole, it didn't follow the contour of the foot, it ignored it entirely. There was no curvature to encourage rolling motion, no give at the arch, no tapering toward the ball. It was a slab, a solid piece of war equipment that clung to the foot not to support it, but to contain it. The stiffness wasn't accidental. It was the result of material, method, and ideology. With every step, the heel struck the ground with a jolt that traveled upward unchecked. The sole didn't absorb it, it transferred it into the ankle, into the shin, into the spine. The foot, designed to absorb impact through a cascade of tiny adjustments, was locked in place. The boot didn't move with the foot. It waited for the foot to surrender. That surrender came slowly. First with blisters, deep red abrasions where the skin rubbed against leather that refused to soften. Then with swelling, as tendons strained against the resistance. Then came the change in posture, the unnatural gait, the sideways tilt, the outward flare of the foot as the body tried to compensate. And always, always the ache, bone deep and rhythmic, pulsing with each step, whispering that the body was adjusting, not to survive, but to endure. The soldiers called it breaking in the boots. But what really broke was not the leather, it was the feet. They adjusted because they had no choice. To march in these boots was to teach your bones a new, harsher rhythm, to unlearn what walking had once felt like, to surrender flexibility in favor of rigidity. And in that surrender, damage accumulated. On flat roads, the pain was dull but manageable. But on uneven terrain, on cobbles, in fields, across frozen rivers, the boots became traps. Without the ability to bend, the sole caught against obstacles, twisted ankles, strained knees. When marching downhill, the foot slid forward, cramming toes against the front. When marching uphill, the heel lifted, rubbing raw the back of the ankle.
There was no relief, no ergonomic counterbalance, no mercy. What made it worse was repetition. One day of pain might be tolerated, but 5, 10, 30? Marches often stretched for weeks with only brief stops to rest. And at night, when the boots finally came off, if they came off at all, the damage revealed itself in swollen joints, cracked heels, and feet that trembled when they touched the earth again. Some soldiers tried to outwit the boot. They cut slits in the leather to encourage flex. They stuffed grass or cloth to create makeshift cushioning. But these were temporary fixes. The structure remained unbending, a shell cast from the same unforgiving mold. And so the pain continued, not as a punishment, but as a feature. It wasn't just physical. The psychological toll of this immobility wore men down. Each step was a reminder that the machine didn't care, that the very thing meant to carry them forward was also holding them back. The boot became an enemy in disguise, always close, always unavoidable, always hurting. In modern terms, the boots would be considered orthopedic disasters. But in that era, they were considered normal. The inability to bend was not viewed as a flaw. It was tradition. It was structure. It was discipline made tangible. And if the price was a limp, or a fractured toe, or a back thrown out before a battle even began, so be it. Because the boots didn't bend, and neither, in theory, should the man. There was no right boot, no left either. Just two identical forms, mirror images of a single design, cut from the same pattern, built on the same unforgiving last. This was the standard known as the straight last, a concept that seems almost absurd to modernize, but was entirely logical to the armies of the 18th century. Why carve different molds for right and left feet when you could produce twice as many boots from a single shape? To the military mind, this was elegant simplicity, efficient, economical, rational. A shoemaker could churn out identical pairs without pausing to differentiate. A quartermaster could stack them, count them, issue them with the speed of a butcher tossing cuts across a counter. There was no need for mirrored inventory, no confusion over mismatches, just two boots, interchangeable, symmetrical, unshaped, ready to be filled. But for the man who had to wear them, this symmetry was its own special kind of torment. Human feet, after all, are not symmetrical. They curve, they tilt, they favor one side. The right foot bears weight differently than the left. To impose identical boots onto two distinctly shaped feet was to demand adaptation through pain. And so began the brutal ritual known by soldiers as breaking them in. It wasn't the boots that changed, it was the feet. At first, both boots sat stiff and square, hugging neither the arch nor the curve of the foot. The toes pressed against the front, the sides pinched, and the heel slid with every step. The body tried to adjust, tilting slightly, favoring one foot, shortening strides. But the boots resisted. They pressed back. The result was a kind of slow, cruel carving. As the soldier walked, marched, climbed, and stood for hours on end, the pressure points multiplied. The inner side of each foot ached for space. The outer edge, compressed, grew numb. Skin peeled, calluses bloomed. The bones inside the foot strained to find a new rhythm, a way to move forward while imprisoned in a mold that never truly fit. Some soldiers resorted to tricks. They soaked their boots in water, hoping the leather would soften enough to take shape faster. Others packed the toes with straw or paper, or hammered the stiff soles against stone to break their resistance. But most had no time for rituals. They had only distance and pain. Over weeks of wear, the boots would begin to shift, not intentionally, not intelligently, but under the brute force of repetition. The left foot, slightly wider, might push out the side. The right, more angled, would eventually warp the toe. Bit by bit,
The boots would begin to mirror the feet inside them, not because they were designed to, but because the body demanded it. But the damage was already done. Tendons inflamed, arches collapsed, nails darkened and fell away. The middle toes, crushed inward, often curled permanently, locked in a bent position that never quite straightened again. And always there were the blisters, layers of skin peeled back by hours of friction in a space that offered no natural fit. This process, described in training manuals with detached indifference, was presented as a normal part of military life. It was expected that a soldier would suffer for weeks before the boots became tolerable. Tolerable, not comfortable. Comfort was never the goal. The boots weren't meant to embrace, they were meant to conform, eventually through exhaustion and repetition. And so each man carried, on his feet, the evidence of this grim adaptation. No two boots looked the same after a campaign. One sagged at the side, the other twisted at the toe. They slanted, creaked, held odd bulges where bone had pushed and leather had surrendered. They were not matched pairs anymore. They were battered relics of a slow war between flesh and form. Yet even then, there was no sense of injustice, no call for redesign. The idea that boots could be pre-shaped for right and left feet would not become widespread until the late 19th century. Until then, soldiers continued to walk in symmetry that never existed in their own bodies, enduring a lesson only pain could teach, that uniformity in design does not equal equality in experience. They didn't wear right boots and left boots, they wore boots, and their feet, in silence, bore the burden of making the difference. The boots began their work on the first day. With the first march came the first rub, an innocent sting at the back of the heel, the side of the big toe, beneath the ball of the foot. It was easy to dismiss at first. A soldier might grit his teeth, adjust his stride, shift his weight slightly. But the leather did not forgive. With each step, the friction returned. And by the end of the day, where there had been a sting, now there was a raw patch of skin. This was the entry point, a tear just wide enough to break the seal of the body. From there, everything followed: the reddening, the swelling, the heat. Blisters, fluid-filled, fragile, bubbled across the pressure points, then burst open during the next march. The sweat and dirt of the day seeped in. The open skin met damp wool socks and the rough interior of a boot that had never been smoothed or softened. Infection didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It crept in quietly, on the back of every grain of mud, every drop of blood. These weren't surface wounds. They dug in, layered deeper with each passing day. When a blister hardened, it cracked. When it cracked, it bled. And when it bled, it fed the invisible storm building beneath. Inflammation took root. Limbs swelled. Ankles thickened and throbbed. The foot stopped functioning like a jointed machine and became something else: blunt, bloated, slow. Toenails were among the first casualties. Constant impact inside a boot that gave no space meant the nails smashed against leather day after day. They darkened. They separated from the skin. Many fell off entirely, peeled away by pressure and infection. New growth was irregular, thick, curved, sensitive. Each nail lost was a reminder that the boots never stopped taking. Then came the cold. In mild weather, a soldier might limp his way through recovery. But in winter, especially the kind faced on the road to Moscow, every injury turned dangerous. A foot already swollen and bleeding could not regulate warmth. Wet boots soaked in snow turned feet into ice blocks. Circulation slowed. Sensation disappeared. What started as numbness in the toes soon became something worse. Frostbite didn't scream, it whispered. By the time a man realized he couldn't feel his foot, the tissue had already begun to die. Flesh blackened, skin hardened like bark. A toe would become a thing separate from the body, a lifeless attachment that no longer belonged. And if that soldier kept marching, and he had to, he might reach camp to discover that part of him had already been left behind.
not metaphorically, but physically. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics. Medical attention in the field was scarce and prioritized the wounded in battle. A man limping from infection or frostbite was told to rest if he could, walk it off if he couldn't. Often, his only real treatment came in the form of a knife. Amputation was fast and crude, performed without anesthesia, often on the bare ground, with the same saw used for dozens of others that day. If you were lucky, you lost a toe. If unlucky, half a leg. And then there was gangrene. This was the end stage, when infections spread unchecked, when blood no longer reached the flesh, when tissue began to rot from within. The smell gave it away first, a sickly sweet, putrid odor that clung to the air and to the memory. The foot darkened, then collapsed into itself. The man's skin took on a gray sheen, and fever followed. There was no coming back from this on the road. If he was not already too weak to march, he soon would be. The boots he had worn, the very tools of his service, would become his final prison. Some men carried this decay quietly. Shame surrounded injury, especially of the foot. A soldier who could not walk was a soldier who could not fight. He became a burden to his unit, a weak link, and so many limped in silence, hiding blood-soaked socks, wincing through orders, willing their legs forward out of pride or fear. Others broke down, collapsed in the mud, left behind by necessity, not cruelty. The march couldn't stop. All of this began with a pair of boots. Not with musket wounds or saber strikes, not with explosions or ambushes, but with the slow, grinding attrition of poorly made, rigid footwear that rubbed flesh until it broke and opened the door to ruin. The true enemy, for many, was not the opposing army. It was the cold geometry of the gear they were forced to wear. It was the refusal of leather to yield. It was the arrogance of a system that believed feet could be bent to its will without consequence. And so the boots did what bullets often could not. They wore men down, from the inside out, step by step, from blisters to bone. At first, the pain is physical, a sting, a rub, a blister. But as the miles stretch on, as days blur into nights, and boots remain laced tight over wounds that never fully close, the ache begins to seep into the mind. What was once a localized discomfort becomes something else entirely, a persistent, gnawing presence that shadows every thought, dulls every emotion, and poisons the very core of a man's endurance. When your feet hurt, everything else hurts more. And for Napoleon soldiers, whose world was reduced to marching, fighting, and marching again, foot pain was not a background nuisance. It was the soundtrack of their existence. There is a particular cruelty in the kind of pain that doesn't scream, but whispers constantly. It's the ache that wakes you before dawn, the stab that interrupts your step, the fire that returns every time you sit still to notice how raw everything feels. And worst of all, it's the knowing that there's no relief waiting, no warm bath, no clean socks, no soft shoes, only the same stiff boots and the same road ahead. As the physical strain accumulated, so did its emotional weight. Men who had once joked during marches grew silent. Camaraderie gave way to irritation. The small kindnesses, sharing bread, offering water, adjusting pack straps, dwindled as each soldier folded inward, retreating into himself to preserve what little strength he had. The pain made them selfish, sharp, short-tempered. Even close friends grew distant. A man limping behind slowed the entire unit. One more pause meant fewer hours of rest at night. The wounded became liabilities. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. If you fell too far behind, you wouldn't be carried. You'd be left. Fatigue became suspicion. If a man claimed he couldn't go on, others glanced at his boots, his feet, searching for signs, real or imagined, of weakness. Was he faking? Was he trying to get out of duty? There were no clear lines between injury and despair, between blister and breakdown. Morale didn't shatter all at once. It eroded quietly, grain by grain, with each step taken in agony. And then came the deeper toll, the erosion of will, the belief that the march would never end, that no victory could be worth this, that no order could justify the torment pressed against bone with every step. Soldiers began to lose faith, not just in the campaign, but in the cause. The enemy no longer wore different colors. The enemy was the mud, the cold, the slope of the hill, the weight of the pack, the tightness of the boot. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of frustration, the enemy was their own commander, the abstract hierarchy that had put those boots on their feet and expected them to walk, regardless. Resentment festered in silence. Some muttered under their breath. Others lashed out at their officers, their comrades, even their horses. Not from hatred, but from a kind of desperation, an invisible pressure valve releasing in sudden bursts. The boots didn't just wear down the feet, they wore down the man inside them. Inch by inch, mile by mile, until he no longer recognized the soldier he had once been. For some, the anger turned inward. If others marched and they couldn't, it must be their own fault. Weakness, shame, a creeping sense of failure, even when the evidence was written in blood. They began to hide their wounds, to lie about their pain, to push farther than they should have, until something snapped. Not just in tendon or muscle, but in spirit. Sleep offered no refuge. When the boots came off, the pain throbbed louder. When they stayed on, the foot swelled and pulsed against the tight walls. In either case, the soldier woke more tired than he had gone to sleep, and the day started again, with dread. Not dread of battle, but of walking. That quiet terror of the next 10 miles, the next hill, the next step. And there, in that quiet terror, was the turning point. The moment when the boots were no longer a tool or a uniform. They were a threat, an antagonist, the weight at the bottom of every soldier's soul. They could not be removed. They could not be argued with. They offered no escape. The boots were the burden that never lifted, the voice that never stopped whispering, "Keep moving or be left behind." So they kept moving, but something inside them stopped. The pain dulled not because it healed, but because the spirit gave up trying to fight it. In that surrender, the boots had won. Not the war, but the war inside the man. Winter didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, first with colder mornings, then frozen puddles, then frost that clung to wool coats before the sun had a chance to melt it. And then, without warning, everything froze solid. The mud turned to glass, the wind turned to knives, and the soldiers of the Grande Armée found themselves caught in a world that no longer obeyed the logic of movement. Roads disappeared beneath snow. Fires gave little heat. The air itself seemed to bite. And on their feet, still those boots. The same rigid leather prisons that had tormented them through the heat of Spain and the Rhine of Germany. But now the torment changed. It deepened, turned from abrasion to something crueler, something colder. The leather, once merely stiff, froze overnight. Boots left by the fire turned to stone by morning, their seams curling open, the soles pulling away from the body like cracked bark. The glue, what little held the layers together, lost its bond in the moisture. Nails rusted, stitching tore. Men awoke to find their only protection against the frozen ground had come apart in the dark. And with nowhere to repair them, they did what they could, wrapped their feet in rags, stuffed straw between their toes, tied scraps of coat around their ankles. It barely mattered. The cold seeped through everything. There was no rotation of gear, no second pair waiting in the wagon. The boots they wore into Russia were the boots they would wear out or die in.
Some tried to dry them near the campfires, only to scorch the leather and make it harder, more brittle. Others never removed them at all. Feet swollen with frost, skin fused to the lining, boots frozen so tight they had to be cut off, if a knife could be found sharp enough to pierce the icy hide. Marching became a ritual of agony. Snow slipped into gaps between boot and leg, melted, then refroze around the ankle. Every step felt like breaking through a crust of glass. Toes lost sensation first, then the soles, then the entire foot. Men began to fall behind not from hunger, not from wounds, but because they could no longer feel their legs. They tried to keep moving, to stamp life back into their limbs, but it was too late. Their boots had turned into traps. They no longer served to carry, they anchored. Those who survived learned to improvise. Some stole boots from fallen comrades, peeling them from stiff corpses like bark from frozen trees. Others tore up blankets and fashioned crude wraps, lashing them to their feet with belts or torn straps. A few found local peasants and traded coins, buttons, or food for wool socks, animal skins, or anything resembling warmth. But the supply was never enough. The cold outnumbered them all. The roads from Moscow became rivers of ice and misery. Horses collapsed, cannons were abandoned. But it was in the soldiers' feet that the full story of the retreat was written. Feet blackened from frostbite, feet split open from pressure, feet left behind in the snow, wrapped in boots that no longer looked like anything man-made. And through it all, they kept walking. Because to stop was to surrender. And to surrender to the cold was not to rest, it was to vanish. One moment you were trudging forward, the next sitting down just for a minute, eyes closing against the wind, boots still on your feet, and then nothing. Many were found that way, upright, frozen in place, as if time had stopped around them. Their boots still intact, the leather still wrapped tight around legs that would never take another step. This wasn't war in the traditional sense. There were no charges, no volleys, no banners waving over frozen hills. This was survival against something older than strategy, colder than enemy fire. And in this war, the boots were no longer neutral. They were agents of suffering. They cracked under pressure, split under cold, betrayed the feet they were meant to protect. And when they failed, they didn't just slow a soldier, they sealed his fate. The men who returned from Russia, those who managed to limp or crawl or be dragged across that white abyss, carried the story not in their memories, but in their scars. Missing toes, shattered arches, feet that never walked the same again. And always, in their minds, the shape of those boots. Stiff, square, and silent, like coffins made for marching. Because in that winter, it was not the cold alone that defeated the army. It was the fact that when the snow came and the winds screamed, the boots remained exactly what they had always been, unprepared, unyielding, and unforgiving. The retreat from Russia was not a retreat in the military sense. It was a collapse, slow, chaotic, and suffocating. What began as a strategic withdrawal turned into a death march through snow and silence. The soldiers were no longer a disciplined army, but a scattered mass of hungry, broken men dragging themselves westward through a landscape that seemed to want them gone. And under them, those boots, or what remained of them, told the story of how quickly an army turns to dust when its foundation fails. By the time the snow settled and the cold deepened, many soldiers had already lost the soles of their boots. The seams had split weeks before, and now every step opened the leather wider, like wounds yawning beneath the weight of exhaustion. Soles peeled away completely, flapping like tongues in the snow, catching ice, filling with slush. Some tried to nail them back together using scraps of metal or bits of fencing. Others tied them with rope, thread, wire, anything that could simulate a shoe. But the boots, never meant to survive this climate, surrendered to it. And their failure cost more than comfort. It cost lives. Men began to lose their boots altogether.
They came off in deep snow, torn from feet swollen with frostbite, or were cut away to reach blackened toes that needed to be removed. Some boots were stolen in the night from the sleeping or the dead. Others were abandoned, too ruined to be worth carrying another mile. And once the boots were gone, the clock started ticking. No one could last long barefoot in Russian winter. Even wrapped in rags, the exposure was brutal. Men tore strips from their uniforms, pulled shirts from their backs to bind their feet. They used scarves, tent cloth, saddle padding, fur if they were lucky enough to find it. They packed moss, hay, straw into makeshift bundles and tied them with belts or rifle straps. These were not shoes. They were desperate layers, meant only to keep the frost from reaching flesh for one more hour, one more mile. Some turned to the ways of the locals. They tried to craft lapti, woven bark sandals used by Russian peasants, twisting birch fibers into fragile mesh to slip over wrapped feet. These makeshift shoes offered slight protection, just enough to lift the foot off the ice. But they disintegrated quickly under the strain of the march. Still, it was better than nothing. In a landscape where frostbite could set in within minutes, even the thinnest barrier meant survival. Despite their efforts, thousands couldn't outrun the cold. Their feet blackened, split, turned to stone. The pain stopped, but only because the nerves had died. Then came the rot. In hastily assembled field tents, surgeons sawed through legs with no anesthesia, slicing through frozen skin and shattered bone, while others held the patient down. The boots, if they were still on the foot, had to be cut away like bandages. Sometimes, when they were finally removed, they took skin with them. The amputations were fast, brutal, and often fatal, not because the surgery itself killed, but because the wound couldn't stay clean. There was no sterile cloth, no medicine, no rest. The soldier, half a leg lighter, was sent back into the snow, on a sled if he was lucky, on foot if not. And if he didn't have boots, he didn't make it far. Those who still had boots wore them until nothing remained. Holes gaped through the toes. The leather cracked and split. Some wore both boots on one foot, switching sides to rest one leg while dragging the other. Others cut apart ruined footwear to fashion straps or padding. Nothing was wasted. A single usable sole could mean the difference between progress and collapse. And still the march dragged on. The roads were littered with lost boots, discarded wrappings, trails of blood frozen into the snow. Every few steps, a man knelt to rewrap his feet, only to fall behind. Many didn't get back up, not because they didn't want to, but because the pain had become stronger than the will to move. When your feet fail, your body follows. You no longer stumble, you sink. Their work was dirty, exhausting, and never finished. For every boot they fixed, 5 more arrived in worse condition. And as the retreat from Russia unfolded, the demand became impossible. The cold cracked the leather faster than it could be stitched. Nails refused to grip through frozen soles. Fingers lost their dexterity from frostbite. Yet still they worked. In tents, under wagons, hunched behind trees, anywhere there was a flat surface and a soldier still able to walk. They were craftsmen operating in the ruins of a system that had given them nothing to work with. Supply lines collapsed, tools were lost, raw materials ran dry. Cobblers began bartering for leather, exchanging repairs for food or firewood. They skinned dead cattle themselves, tore strips from uniforms, reused shoelaces, cut buttons into makeshift studs. They were surgeons of leather, forced to do amputations on boots that were long past saving. Sometimes the cobbler was a fellow soldier,
an infantryman with a background in shoemaking back home, pressed into service when his comrades realized he had the skill. He would set aside his musket after dark and stitch by lantern light, his lap filled with damp, half-frozen boots. Word of such men spread fast. Soldiers limped for miles just to find the one man in the battalion who could give their foot another few days of movement. His camp became a pilgrimage site, his needle more valuable than any blade. But even miracles had limits. No matter how skilled, the cobblers could not work faster than the war destroyed. Their repairs were temporary, their materials exhausted. There was never enough thread, never enough dry leather. And no matter how well they patched or reinforced, they were always working behind the curve. Boots that should have been retired weeks ago kept returning, soaked, shredded, useless. Sometimes they turned men away, not out of cruelty, but because the boot had passed the point of saving. A hole too large, a sole too thin, a foot too broken. Still, they tried. They stitched until their fingers bled, until the firewood ran out, until the snow made glue freeze in its pot. And for that effort, uncelebrated, often unpaid, they earned no medals, no glory. But their work was visible in every soldier who made it another day down the road, in every man who could still stand for inspection, in every march that didn't end in collapse.
They were the heroes of survival, operating not with weapons, but with thread and hide and bone-deep resilience. In the story of Napoleon's army, the cobblers didn't write history, but they kept history walking, one step, one boot, one miracle at a time. When the boots failed, and they often did, it wasn't commanders or quartermasters who came to the rescue. It was the soldier himself, standing ankle-deep in snow or mud, staring down at the wreckage on his feet, realizing that no help was coming. There was no supply train with fresh pairs, no officer ready to offer replacements. What he had to make work. And so, in the cold logic of survival, ingenuity took root. The solutions weren't elegant. They were desperate. But they worked, sometimes just enough to get through one more day, one more march, one more frozen hour before collapse. Soldiers turned to whatever was around them: fabric, hay, fur, rope, bone. They improvised not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was to stop. And stopping meant surrendering to frost, infection, or exhaustion. One of the first tricks was to cut the boots down. The high leather shafts, meant to protect the leg, often stiffened in the cold, digging into calves and constricting circulation. Soldiers took knives, when they had them, or jagged metal scraps and sliced away the upper portion, turning knee-high torture devices into makeshift ankle boots. The loss of protection was accepted. At least now they could walk without blood pooling in their socks. Others resorted to stuffing the inside with anything they could find: dry grass, leaves, even horsehair, packed into the boot like insulation. It didn't fix the structure, but it added warmth and a layer of shock absorption between leather and skin. In villages or forests, some gathered hay from abandoned barns, twisting it into tight bundles before forcing it around their feet. When they ran out of natural filler, they tore their own shirts and undergarments into strips, layering the inside with cloth until the boot fit snugly again, or at least didn't bite. Then came the external solutions. Soldiers began to wrap their boots with strips of fabric, cut from discarded coats or even from the dead. These podmotki, bandage-like wrappings, served to hold the boot together, reinforce seams, and keep snow from creeping in through gaps. Some wrapped the entire lower leg, creating a thick, mummified look, held in place with string, twine, or even the leather straps from destroyed packs. In colder regions, fur became currency. Soldiers who could scavenge it, whether from civilians, battlefield debris, or dead animals, used it to line the insides of their boots or wrap it directly around bare feet.
fox pelts, rabbit skins, even ragged pieces of sheepskin became part of the makeshift uniform. Some tied fur patches to the outside of their boots, creating a crude double layer that held heat a few degrees longer. It was never enough, but it slowed the frost. When all else failed, they made new footwear entirely. Lapti, woven bark shoes borrowed from Russian peasant tradition, became an unlikely salvation. Soldiers stripped bark from birch trees, soaked it, twisted it into flexible cords, and wove crude sandals. They tied them to their feet over layers of rags, using them more like snowshoes than boots. These didn't last long, usually a day or two, but they lifted the foot off the ice just enough to matter. Others scavenged horse blankets and saddle leather, fashioning crude soles by hammering pieces flat and lashing them to the foot with string or belts. The result was more a platform than a shoe, but it gave traction. Some even sacrificed their own packs, cutting straps and flaps to patch holes or cover exposed toes. The ingenuity extended beyond materials to behavior. Soldiers began walking in a different gait, flattened, knees bent, feet dragging, designed to reduce pressure on sensitive points. They marched at night to avoid direct sun thawing their boots into wet traps. They shared foot-saving knowledge and whispers, tips passed between regiments like contraband, how to rub snow on frostbite to delay necrosis, how to tie boots with cross wraps to prevent heel slippage, how to dry them overnight by placing them under their own bodies while sleeping. Every trick came from experience, trial and error, paid for in blisters, blood, and frozen toes. There were no manuals, no instructions, just a relentless drive to keep moving. And in that creativity, you could see not just desperation, but dignity, the refusal to surrender, the determination to adapt. In every torn scrap wrapped around a foot, in every reshaped bark, in every reshaped boot was the soul of a man saying, "I'm not done yet." The army may have failed him. The leather may have cracked. But as long as he had fingers, fabric, and fire, he would keep walking. Even if every step was stitched together by nothing more than willpower and string. There was a strange kind of reverence surrounding the boot, a belief that its form, however flawed, was not to be questioned. Not because it was perfect, but because it was correct. In the minds of generals and quartermasters, its silhouette had become sacred. Straight shaft, no curve. Thick sole, heavy leather. It was more than footwear. It was a symbol. And symbols are rarely redesigned. No one denied the pain. Officers limped just as their men did. Cobblers complained of the endless repairs. But still the pattern remained untouched. The shape, the stiffness, the flaws, carried from campaign to campaign like an unspoken oath. The boot was part of the uniform, and the uniform was part of the myth. A soldier was not simply clothed. He was forged into something greater, and pain was part of that forging. To alter the boot was to disrupt the image. That image mattered, not just for appearance, but for discipline. The tight line of soldiers, identical from head to foot, was a statement of power. Each man became part of a collective rhythm, and the boots, those black, rigid columns, were as much about psychological cohesion as they were about practical use. Marching in unison, striking the ground with a single mechanical beat, created something larger than any individual. That sound, that posture, that shape, it all spoke of order. To design for comfort would have meant designing for variation. Comfort requires adaptation. It requires attention to detail, to difference, to need. But armies weren't built around need. They were built around obedience. A comfortable boot might be better for the soldier, but it was worse for the system. Besides, discomfort had become a kind of virtue. It hardened the body. It trained the mind. Officers believed that suffering forged discipline, that pain in the foot built strength in the heart. A boot that made you bleed was a boot that reminded you who you were, a servant of empire, not a seeker of comfort. The idea that better design might lead to better performance never entered the conversation, not because it lacked logic, but because it lacked ritual. And in the military, ritual was everything. Then came the external solutions. Soldiers began to wrap their boots with strips of fabric cut from discarded coats or even from the dead. These podmotki, bandage-like wrappings, served to hold the boot together, reinforce seams, and keep snow from creeping in through gaps. Some wrapped the entire lower leg, creating a thick, mummified look, held in place with string, twine, or even the leather straps from destroyed packs. In colder regions, fur became currency. Soldiers who could scavenge it, whether from civilians, battlefield debris, or dead animals, used it to line the insides of their boots or wrap it directly around bare feet. Fox pelts, rabbit skins, even ragged pieces of sheepskin became part of the makeshift uniform. Some tied fur patches to the outside of their boots, creating a crude double layer that held heat a few degrees longer. It was never enough, but it slowed the frost. When all else failed, they made new footwear entirely. Lapti, woven bark shoes borrowed from Russian peasant tradition, became an unlikely salvation. Soldiers stripped bark from birch trees, soaked it, twisted it into flexible cords, and wove crude sandals. They tied them to their feet over layers of rags, using them more like snowshoes than boots. These didn't last long, usually a day or two, but they lifted the foot off the ice just enough to matter. Others scavenged horse blankets and saddle leather, fashioning crude soles by hammering pieces flat and lashing them to the foot with string or belts. The result was more a platform than a shoe, but it gave traction. Some even sacrificed their own packs, cutting straps and flaps to patch holes or cover exposed toes. The ingenuity extended beyond materials to behavior. Soldiers began walking in a different gait, flattened, knees bent, feet dragging, designed to reduce pressure on sensitive points. They marched at night to avoid direct sun thawing their boots into wet traps. They shared foot-saving knowledge in whispers, tips passed between regiments like contraband, how to rub snow on frostbite to delay necrosis, how to tie boots with cross wraps to prevent heel slippage, how to dry them overnight by placing them under their own bodies while sleeping. Every trick came from experience, trial and error paid for in blisters, blood, and frozen toes. There were no manuals, no instructions, just a relentless drive to keep moving. And in that creativity, you could see not just desperation, but dignity, the refusal to surrender, the determination to adapt. In every torn scrap wrapped around a foot, in every repurposed length of bark, in every reshaped boot was the soul of a man saying, "I'm not done yet." Some officers even wore riding boots, designed for the saddle rather than the road, tall, elegant, and entirely unsuitable for marching. But most of them didn't march, they rode. While their men waded through rivers and mud, officers kept their feet dry. Their boots, polished and intact, rarely touched the terrain that destroyed the common infantryman's footwear day after day. There was lining, soft cloth or fur stitched into the shaft to prevent chafing, to hold warmth in the cold. Soles were sometimes reinforced with hidden layers of wool or cork for extra insulation and shock absorption. Their heels were shaped, their arches considered, and if the boots wore down, they were repaired immediately by dedicated servants or replaced entirely from private stores. Even within the same freezing camps and brutal marches, these differences mattered. Soldiers noticed. They saw the officer dismounting at dusk, stepping over frozen ground with ease while their own feet bled inside stiff leather shells. They heard the softer tread. They smelled the oil and wax that preserved the officer's boots from water damage. And they understood, without words, that the suffering expected of them was not evenly shared. This wasn't new, and it wasn't hidden. In Napoleonic culture, hierarchy was everything. Just as uniforms marked rank, so did footwear. Fine boots were a silent badge of privilege, a symbol of command, even when the war stripped everything away. They said, "I do not march, I do not freeze, I do not bleed where you bleed." But it went deeper than protection or comfort. Officers, by design, were meant to appear above the fray, cleaner, straighter, untouched by the mud and pain of the front line. Their posture mattered. Their appearance was part of discipline. If a commander slumped, limped, or showed signs of wear, morale faltered. So their boots helped preserve not just their feet, but the illusion of invulnerability. Yet this division also fed quiet bitterness. For the soldier limping in split soles, every polished officer's step was a reminder of the system's divide. It wasn't just about boots. It was about who was allowed to suffer and who was protected. The difference between command and obedience wasn't only measured in words. It was felt with every stone pressed into a foot, every frostbitten toe, every march completed with blood soaking through a sock. There were exceptions. Some officers tried to match their men, to walk instead of ride, to wear the same gear. But even then, they had the choice. They could return to the saddle. They could change their boots. The men could not. In the grand myth of Napoleon's army, glorious, mobile, relentless, it's easy to imagine every man moving as one. But the truth was written in leather, in the softness of one boot and the stiffness of another, in the quiet luxury of warm soles and the raw pain of walking without them. Because even in the mud, even in the snow, privilege had a shape, and it wrapped itself around the officer's foot. The march never ended. That was the feeling, deep in the bone, deeper in the mind. Even when the soldiers stopped to eat or sleep or shiver in place, their legs twitched with the memory of movement. The rhythm of endless steps had imprinted itself into them, boots dragging, ankles swelling, knees locking from the strain. And through it all, their souls thinned with each passing mile, until there was almost nothing left between their flesh and the earth. The design of the Napoleonic boot, thick leather, nailed soles, rigid upper, wasn't built for this kind of punishment. It was made to look strong, to impose shape, to fit into the logic of uniformity. But the boots weren't made to survive weeks of forced marches across frozen ground, over sharp stones, through wet clay, brambles, and cobbled roads that never seemed to end. A good pair of boots might hold up for a short campaign, but Napoleon didn't fight short campaigns. His armies moved like tides, slow, powerful, and relentless. And nothing wore down faster than what they wore on their feet. By the second week of marching, most boots had already begun to show signs of failure. The stitching at the toe frayed, the sole peeling at the edge, the heel softened, compressed, collapsing under the weight. After another week, the front of the sole often detached entirely, flapping like a torn page with every step. Some men tried to nail it back in place with scraps of metal. Others wrapped cloth or rope to hold the pieces together. But the deterioration was constant, unstoppable. The march didn't wait for repairs. Leather soles, especially when soaked, became slick, heavy, and fragile. Rain and snow soaked into the fibers, warping the shape, loosening the glue, rusting the nails. At night, boots froze into twisted sculptures that had to be thawed near fire or forced back on to swollen feet with gritted teeth. Drying them helped little. Every time they dried, they shrank. And when they shrank, they cracked. Lines appeared along the bend of the foot, growing wider, deeper, until the sole simply gave out. Many soldiers, faced with this collapse, kept walking anyway. They had to. There was no replacement. No spare pair waiting at the next checkpoint. Once the sole was gone, they walked on the inner leather. When that wore through, on the bare foot. Some padded the inside with hay, scraps of cloth, folded paper, anything to reduce the shock of each step. Others tied rags directly around the boot,
creating makeshift slippers that disintegrated every few miles. The effect on the body was immediate and brutal. Without soles, the foot absorbed every impact directly. Stones pressed into the arch. Ice sliced the skin. Wood splinters, glass, iron fragments, all invisible enemies buried in the ground, now fully exposed to raw flesh. The pain wasn't just sharp, it was cumulative. By the end of a day's march, the legs trembled not from exhaustion alone, but from thousands of tiny insults delivered to nerves and bone. Some tried to protect their feet with layers, wrapping multiple socks if they had them, or cutting padding from their coats. But cloth soaked through quickly. In mud, nothing stayed dry, and once wet, it became a sponge, holding cold against the skin, inviting infection. A boot without a sole was more than useless. It was dangerous. But throwing it away wasn't an option. Even a ruined boot offered some protection, so they wore them anyway. They tied them on with twine, they packed them with straw, they limped. In the worst cases, soldiers marched in only one boot, shifting it between feet as pain dictated. 10 steps on the left, 10 on the right. Others fashioned makeshift soles from strips of wood, tied with leather cords. These shoes were heavy, awkward, and painful, but they lifted the foot off the ground, which sometimes meant the difference between marching and crawling. Every mile left behind a trail not just of bodies, but of discarded boots, twisted, torn, hollowed husks abandoned in the snow or trampled into the mud. Some soldiers took the boots off fallen comrades, even if they didn't fit. A size too small was preferable to none at all. A sole with holes was better than bleeding bare. But the supply was never enough. The army moved faster than its own ability to sustain itself, faster than its shoes could hold up. And through it all, the marching continued. It was the rhythm of survival, of duty, of desperation, but also of destruction. Every step a negotiation with pain. Every day a choice between continuing forward or giving in to the reality that your boots, your only defense against the ground, had already failed, and your body would soon follow. The march never ended, and for many, neither did the damage. When the campaigns were over, the injuries remained. Arches collapsed, tendons tore, toes fused or twisted or disappeared entirely. The march had passed through them, left its mark in their walk, in their posture, in the silence they carried with them long after the war. Because when the boots failed, it wasn't just leather that wore away, it was the man inside, step by step, until there was nothing left to carry. Could boots have changed the outcome of a war? It seems like a small thing, too small to shape the fate of an empire. But ask the men who marched through Russia with blood in their socks and frost in their bones. Ask those who left pieces of themselves behind with every step, not from bullets or bayonets, but from boots that disintegrated before the first snow fell. To them, footwear wasn't a detail, it was survival. And as modern historians look back at Napoleon's disastrous retreat, the question is no longer absurd. What if the army had worn different boots? The Grande Armée didn't lose in a single moment. It unraveled mile by mile, tendon by tendon, through a slow degradation of human strength. And at the foundation of that collapse, literally, was what the men had on their feet. The soldiers who couldn't walk couldn't fight. The ones who couldn't fight slowed down the rest. And the ones who slowed down died. The domino effect was physical, not theoretical. It started with blisters and ended with a breakdown of movement, timing, cohesion. Some historians argue that footwear was not just a passive element of the retreat, it was an active contributor to the scale of the disaster. The boots, already flawed by design, were pushed beyond their limits in terrain and weather they were never meant to withstand. They cracked, split, froze. They exposed the feet to cold and infection, immobilized the wounded, turned soldiers into liabilities instead of assets. When you lose mobility, you lose options. And in a war where movement was everything, Napoleon's immobile soldiers were already defeated before the enemy even appeared. So, could it have been different? Look at the British. During the Napoleonic Wars, British infantry often wore ankle boots with gaiters, a system that allowed for easier movement, better airflow in hot climates, and faster drying in the wet. While not perfect by any means, they allowed more foot flexibility and were easier to replace or repair. The British supply system, though slower, was built around sustainability. Soldiers carried tools to fix their gear. Units had cobblers. Feet were inspected. It wasn't compassion, it was strategy. A soldier who can walk is a soldier who can shoot. The Prussians, known for their discipline, wore high leather boots similar in shape to the French, but their materials were often thicker and the attention to stitching slightly better. More importantly, their shorter campaigns and tighter logistics meant their boots rarely had to survive the brutal distance endured by the Grande Armée. The Russians, paradoxically, were the least uniformed and the best adapted to their own land. Many Russian troops wore lapti, felt boots, or soft leather moccasins reinforced with wrappings. While crude by Western standards, this footwear had one distinct advantage: it worked in the cold. It was flexible, fast-drying, easy to repair. It adapted to the environment rather than resisting it. French soldiers, on the other hand, wore standard-issue leather boots that ignored the realities of terrain. There was no version adapted for snow, no winter model, no regional modification. A boot that served in Italy was expected to serve in Russia, and that rigidity of doctrine, not just leather, became a fatal flaw. Speculative? Yes, but warfare is often determined by the smallest fractures. A soldier who can't move delays the line. A delayed line misses a bridge. A missed bridge becomes an encirclement. The ripple begins at the boot.
Imagine a different campaign, one where the French army had lightweight, insulated, waterproof footwear, where soldiers could dry their boots overnight, where soles flexed instead of cracked, where trench foot and frostbite didn't eat away at morale before the first shot was fired. Would that army have moved faster, reached supply depots sooner, avoided collapses, held formations longer? We can't know for sure, but we can say this: the collapse of the Grande Armée didn't happen only because of Russian resistance or bad luck. It happened in part because the very gear meant to carry them forward became the thing that held them back. Their boots weren't just insufficient. They were symbolic of a system that refused to adapt, a system that valued uniformity over utility, image over endurance. So yes, in a war of inches and hours, where cold and time are deadlier than cannonballs, it's not a stretch to say that better boots might have changed everything, not just for the feet, but for history. Across the muddy roads of Europe, soldiers marched under different flags, but not always in different conditions. The snow fell the same on English shoulders as it did on French. The mud clung to Prussian heels just as stubbornly as it did to Russian soles. Yet, as armies collided, retreated, regrouped, and advanced again, one truth stood out quietly beneath the noise of gunfire and glory. Some soldiers were simply better shod than others. And in this overlooked arena, the French lost ground long before they lost battles. Take the Prussians, for instance. Their boots, sturdy, high, and brutal, earned the nickname hooves among the French. Made from thick leather with reinforced soles and tall shafts that hugged the calf, they weren't comfortable by modern standards, but they were durable. Designed less for finesse and more for stomping power, they served well in the flat, often wet terrain of Central Europe. The Prussian military, rigid and detail-oriented, emphasized the longevity of gear, and their boots reflected that mentality. The leather was stiffer, yes, but thicker. The stitching tighter. The soles often nailed with care, not haste. More importantly, Prussian doctrine didn't treat boots as a forgotten afterthought. Logistics mattered. Regiments traveled with repair tools and sometimes dedicated cobblers.
When boots failed, they were fixed, not simply replaced or ignored. And while Prussian boots were still prone to the usual afflictions of the time, blisters, stiffness, waterlogging, they tended to hold their form longer, giving their wearers a critical edge in long marches. Then there were the British, whose infantry wore what many contemporaries referred to as half boots. These ankle-high shoes, paired with canvas or wool gaiters that extended up to the knee, offered more flexibility and faster drying time. Unlike the French tall boots that trapped moisture and stiffened in the cold, the British system allowed for ventilation, and the separate gaiters could be swapped out, washed, or replaced without compromising the entire shoe. British boots were simpler, but that was their strength. Easier to produce, easier to repair, and in a well-maintained army with supply routes that extended like arteries across the globe, resupply was not a dream, it was part of the plan. The British took care of their feet not out of sentiment, but because they knew. An army that marches efficiently fights longer. British soldiers were inspected regularly, not just for formation and discipline, but for footwear. A broken boot was treated like a broken musket. It affected readiness. Meanwhile, the Russians, masters of adaptation in their own unforgiving terrain, often wore felt boots, bast shoes, or soft leather moccasin-style footwear that prioritized insulation over rigidity. They wrapped their legs in layers, used natural materials from their environment, and accepted improvisation as doctrine. In the snows of the Russian campaign, their footwear may have looked primitive, but it worked. It bent, it warmed, it could be rebuilt with what was at hand. The French? They marched in what they always had. Tall, symmetrical, stiff leather boots, designed for a different kind of war. Beautiful in parades, uniform in silhouette, a symbol of Napoleonic strength, but a failure in function. Their soles peeled after days in rain. Their shafts froze into armor. Their lack of left or right design led to misalignment, wasted energy, chronic injury. The French boot looked the part, but played it poorly. Why didn't they adapt? Pride played its part, so did inertia. The Grande Armée was built on momentum, political, strategic, cultural. There was little time and less inclination to reconsider something as mundane as footwear. And so, while their enemies quietly stitched better boots, the French advanced across Europe, dragging behind them a logistics chain that couldn't keep up and boots that betrayed their bodies with every step. Even on the battlefield, where posture and readiness could turn the tide, the French suffered small but significant disadvantages. A soldier with blistered heels loads slower, moves slower, hesitates. A soldier whose soles slip in mud fires from a less stable stance. These tiny moments added up, not as dramatic as a cavalry charge, but just as lethal over time. In the end, the French were defeated by many things: coalitions, climate, overstretched ambition. But among the quieter reasons, less glamorous and more insidious, was this: they lost even in the shoes they wore. While their enemies walked in boots that bent, flexed, dried, and survived, they limped in symmetry, in soaked leather, in silence. Sometimes the difference between victory and retreat isn't found on the battlefield, but beneath it, in the footprints left behind. In the world of the early 19th century, everything wore out. Tools, clothes, bodies, nothing was expected to last. Time consumed things quickly, and no one thought it unusual. This wasn't seen as failure or tragedy, it was simply life. Shoes split, metal rusted, bones ached, teeth fell out. The idea of permanence belonged to statues, not to people. And in this mindset, the rapid destruction of a pair of boots didn't raise eyebrows. It was part of the rhythm of the age. Napoleon's soldiers didn't receive new boots and expect them to last a year. They expected them to last a few months at best, and in hard marches, maybe only weeks. By the standards of the time, that was normal. Soldiers didn't complain about worn soles because everything they touched was already fragile. Uniforms shredded at the shoulders,
Buttons popped off. Belts cracked. A musket might misfire after a season of damp weather, and a knife might break in a campfire. Objects were made quickly, in great numbers, and meant to fulfill their purpose before crumbling. Durability was a luxury. Disposability was the rule. The same principle applied to the human body. Pain was not treated as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be accepted. No one expected to go through life without constant soreness, injury, or fatigue. Most peasants walked barefoot in the summers, worked in fields until their hands split, and endured illness with no real concept of medical intervention. A soldier who developed blisters or blackened toes didn't see this as injustice. He saw it as the price of moving forward. Medical understanding, too, reinforced this view. Without modern science, most injuries were treated by bleeding, binding, or amputation. A limping man didn't go to a specialist, he kept limping. A swollen joint wasn't rehabbed, it was ignored until it stopped working. Suffering wasn't hidden, it was expected, even romanticized. Hardship was a sign of endurance. Endurance was a sign of character. To complain was to show weakness, and weakness had no place in war. This mentality created a kind of philosophical detachment from pain. The body was seen as a tool, no different from the musket or the boot. When it worked, it was silent. When it broke, it was patched or left behind. Soldiers didn't count the damage, they accumulated it. Limping became second nature. Loss of sensation in the toes was routine. Blood in the boot didn't even warrant a conversation unless it soaked through to the outside. And behind all this was the quiet assumption that everything ends sooner than it should. Boots wear down. Men wear out. That's the cycle. Fix what you can, endure the rest, and keep moving. There was no fantasy of optimization, no expectation of comfort. A good day wasn't a painless one. It was a day you made it to camp still standing. This wasn't apathy, it was adaptation. The men of the era weren't indifferent to suffering, they had simply built a culture that absorbed it. Hardship was a shared language. A man with broken boots didn't ask for sympathy, he might joke about it, or show the damage like a badge. A soldier who lost a toe didn't mourn it, he kept marching with the rest. So when the boots failed, no one cried out for innovation. They accepted it. When feet swelled or blackened, no one looked to the officers for intervention. They tightened the wrappings, leaned forward, and walked. Because in that world, pain was not a signal to stop. It was a sign that you were still part of the machine, still doing what was expected, still useful. And when usefulness faded, like the boots, like the packs, like the weapons, it was simply time to fall away, quietly, as everything did. In the great paintings of Napoleonic glory, the boots are always there, tall, black, gleaming under the weight of empire. They stand firm beneath storm-wrapped generals and battered drummers perched on rocks, striding across battlefields, frozen forever in romantic poses. They are part of the silhouette, inseparable from the myth. When we picture the soldiers of that era, we don't see their faces first. We see the shape. The hat, the musket, the coat, and below it all, the boots. Straight, solemn, symbolic. And yet, we don't feel them. Art has a way of sanding off pain, polishing suffering into something noble. In portraits, boots are never soaked in blood. They don't gape at the seams, they don't press into blistered skin or wrap around frostbitten toes. Instead, they shine. Their leather looks smooth, unbroken, full of purpose. They become extensions of discipline and heroism, not instruments of agony. The same boots that destroyed feet are the ones that now stand as monuments to endurance. We remember their shape, but not their cruelty. It wasn't just the paintings. The boots walked into legend through woodcuts, gilded engravings, folk songs, and military marches. In imagery circulated across Europe, the marching Frenchman was a symbol of power. His boots, aligned perfectly with thousands of others, were not signs of suffering, but of order. The rhythmic beat of leather on stone was turned into music, an anthem of unity. Even the poems of the era spoke of dusty boots as symbols of adventure, not attrition. They trampled borders, not skin. In propaganda, boots represented presence, a soldier's arrival, the weight of empire, the footprint left behind in foreign soil. They were romanticized as the mark of civilization, of structure, of Napoleonic will. Recruiters used this image to inspire awe. Young men, watching columns march through their towns, didn't see wounds, they saw power. To wear the boots was to become something larger than yourself. No one spoke of what happened after the shine wore off. This was by design. Propaganda doesn't sell pain, it sells narrative. And the boot became a visual anchor for that narrative. Even today, when filmmakers and novelists reconstruct the Napoleonic era, the boots return. They're laced and gleaming, marching in step, echoing across polished floors or frozen fields. The sound of leather meeting earth is used to summon discipline, precision, legacy. But the truth was messier. The real boots were not symbols. They were tools of endurance and suffering, stitched together with haste and neglect. They didn't gleam, they cracked. They didn't support, they punished. The soldier inside them didn't feel like a monument. He felt like meat wrapped in wood. But history, like art, remembers the outlines more than the aches, and so the pain vanished from view, leaving only the form. It's telling that we remember the shape of the boot, but not the foot inside. We quote marching songs and trace famous battles, but rarely pause to imagine the cold sweat between toes, the shredded heels, the slow breakdown of a man walking on open sores. The boots became myth because they looked the part. They aligned with the legend, and legends don't blister. That's how iconography works. It lifts the object out of its context, turns it from something lived into something seen. In museums, we stare at surviving pairs, tall, narrow, blackened with age, and imagine the glory they marched through. We don't think of the soldier limping behind, trying to keep pace. We don't hear the grunt of pain with every step. We don't feel the silence of a man removing his boots at night, peeling blood-soaked cloth from skin that may not last until morning. Instead, we see the boot, upright, imposing, eternal. It became part of the costume of empire, a piece of the myth. And myths, after all, are rarely concerned with how much it hurt to walk. In dusty fields and open reenactment grounds, modern historians and military enthusiasts have laced up replicas of Napoleonic boots, not to pose, but to walk, to test, to feel, even in a controlled world of safety and comfort, what it meant to march in the footwear of a past century. And time and again, these experiments end a same way, with aching feet, astonished eyes, and a simple, brutal conclusion. It really was that bad. Crafted as close as possible to original specifications, these boots are built from untreated leather, shaped on straight lasts, stiff as bark, and devoid of left-right distinction. When reenactors first step into them, there's often a moment of disbelief. The boots don't fit in any modern sense. They resist the foot, push against the natural bend of the toes, compress the arches. Even standing still feels unnatural. Walking is worse. Some try to break them in gradually, wearing them around the house over soft terrain. Others jump directly into long walks across uneven ground to simulate the daily marches of 19th century infantry. Regardless, the result is immediate: blisters, bruising, and instability. The leather digs into the ankle, the heel slips, the sole, flat, hard, and nailed, offers no grip and no give. One reenactor noted, "It feels like walking with your foot trapped in a wooden box that's trying to fight you." In summer, the boots overheat.
The feet sweat, swell, and rub against seams until the skin peels. In rain, they soak through and become heavy sponges, holding water that has nowhere to drain. In winter, they freeze, just as they did 2 centuries ago, turning into stiff shells that must be warmed or hammered back into shape before they can even be worn. Reenactors have reported that, even in brief experiments lasting only hours or days, the level of discomfort is astonishing. Not a theoretical hardship, but a physical assault, constant and cumulative. These experiments are not accidents. They're part of a growing field of experiential history, where academics and enthusiasts put themselves in historical conditions to better understand the material realities of the past. And when it comes to Napoleonic footwear, the consensus is nearly universal. It was a device of endurance, not mobility. Several have attempted multi-day treks in full kit. The boots fail first. The soles begin to delaminate after just a few dozen kilometers. The stitching frays. The straight-cut design causes the foot to slide forward unnaturally, resulting in stubbed toes and strained knees. And these trials are conducted with modern medical knowledge, clean water, painkillers, and dry tents waiting at the end of each day. Still, participants often end up with torn skin, bloody socks, and persistent limps. One historian, after completing a short reenactment march of 40 kilometers, removed his boots to find the skin under both big toenails black and swollen. Another, marching in winter conditions, developed early signs of frostbite despite having access to modern thermal socks. "I thought I was just being dramatic," he later wrote, "until I realized my toes had gone completely numb and I still had another 4 hours to go." Some modern shoemakers who've recreated Napoleonic boots by hand have admitted they felt guilty after wearing them. The pain, they said, was not subtle or gradual. It was immediate and instructive, a reminder that the soldiers who wore them weren't just heroic. They were hardened by necessity, often broken in silence. These first-hand experiences provide something that textbooks cannot: visceral empathy. It's one thing to read about blisters and blood, another to limp with them. It's one thing to see a boot in a glass case, another to feel it hammer your heel with every step. And in that sensation lies the final truth. The suffering wasn't exaggerated by history. If anything, it was understated, dulled by time and myth. The boots were not symbolic trials. They were daily torture devices, standard issue, accepted as normal. And walking even a few miles in them today confirms what countless soldiers knew but rarely said out loud. These boots were not built for marching. They were built for surviving, and even that, barely. The reenactors can untie them, remove the pain, step out. The original soldiers could not. And that difference, temporary discomfort versus unending grind, is what turns these experiments from novelty into revelation. They don't just recreate history, they feel it, and it hurts. If a soldier from Napoleon's army limped into a modern clinic, boots still on, body worn by months of marching, the diagnosis would be immediate and grim. Even without seeing the blisters or the blackened toes, a 21st century physician would recognize the signs of deep structural breakdown. The pain wasn't just skin deep. It reached into the joints, the tendons, the very frame of the body. What the Grande Armée called endurance, modern medicine would call damage, progressive, chronic, and entirely avoidable. The first thing a doctor would note is mechanical misalignment. Marching in symmetrical boots with no distinction between left and right forces the body to compensate with every step. Over time, this unnatural alignment leads to a chain reaction: collapsed arches, overpronation, strain on the knees, torsion in the hips, and eventually lower back degradation. Soldiers likely suffered from what modern orthopedic specialists would classify as patellofemoral pain syndrome, iliotibial band friction syndrome, or chronic plantar fasciitis. Conditions rooted not in disease, but in repetitive stress under poor biomechanical conditions. The stiff leather shafts restricted ankle motion, leading to a phenomenon now called restricted dorsiflexion, the inability to flex the ankle joint properly. This single limitation changes the entire mechanics of walking, forcing compensations at the knee and hip. The result? Joint fatigue, ligament inflammation, and over time, degenerative issues like early-onset arthritis in load-bearing joints. Footwear without cushioning or arch support meant that every impact reverberated upward, unfiltered. Soldiers were essentially walking barefoot on stone, with the additional penalty of constriction. A modern sports doctor would recognize the signs immediately: stress fractures in the metatarsals, Achilles tendon strain, bone bruising, and possibly compartment syndrome, where swelling inside the lower leg cuts off circulation, leading to intense pain and, in extreme cases, tissue death. The longer-term effects would be no less concerning. Medical imaging of veterans from such conditions would likely show degenerative disc disease, spinal compression, and postural imbalances stemming from years of unnatural gait. Soldiers with untreated injuries would have developed chronic musculoskeletal disorders, some even affecting breathing and digestion due to the cumulative tension running up the body. Then there's the issue of infection. Without proper hygiene or breathable materials, the feet became petri dishes for fungal infections, ulcerations, and necrotic tissue. Today, these would fall under diagnoses like cellulitis, tinea pedis, or osteomyelitis, infections that modern antibiotics can treat, but which in the early 1800s often meant amputation or fatal systemic illness. The progression from a simple blister to gangrene was not theoretical, it was routine. Circulation problems, too, were rampant. Boots that constricted the lower leg for hours or days without reprieve could contribute to venous stasis, a condition where blood pools in the legs, increasing the risk of deep vein thrombosis even in young men. Add freezing temperatures to this equation, and the result was vascular collapse. What soldiers called numbness was often the first symptom of peripheral nerve damage, or worse, tissue ischemia, the death of cells from lack of oxygen. Neurologists would diagnose many of these soldiers with chronic neuropathy, possibly reflex sympathetic dystrophy, a painful long-term nerve disorder triggered by injury or repetitive trauma. The constant pressure of boots on nerves, especially around the heel and ball of the foot, would cause burning, tingling, or shooting pain, sensations likely dismissed at the time as weakness or fatigue. The mental toll, too, wouldn't go unnoticed today. Modern physicians understand the close link between chronic pain and psychological distress. Prolonged discomfort from poorly designed footwear could trigger anxiety, depression, and in some cases post-traumatic stress responses, not just from combat, but from the relentless, grinding injury that never healed. In modern military medicine, boots are built with extreme precision, tested for stability, flexibility, temperature control, shock absorption, and even energy return. Soldiers are trained to recognize early signs of injury, and medical teams monitor their gait, posture, and joint health. In Napoleon's time, none of this existed. The boots broke the body slowly, invisibly, until the soldier simply stopped. What the 19th century saw as stoicism, the 21st century sees as neglect, an institutionalized indifference to human mechanics. Had modern doctors been there, they would not only have changed the diagnosis, they would have changed the boots. Because the damage wasn't inevitable, it was designed, stitched into every seam, nailed into every sole, and carved into the lives of thousands who never had the luxury of stepping out of them. Today's soldier walks on the product of 2 centuries of pain, failure, and innovation. Every curve in the sole, every breathable stitch, every shock-absorbing layer inside a modern combat boot is a direct response to the silent suffering of the past. The blisters, frostbite, Fractures and infections endured by generations of infantrymen finally forced a realization once considered too soft for military doctrine. A soldier's feet are a strategic asset, and when they fail, the mission does too. In the 19th century, boots were stiff, symmetrical, and indifferent. By the early 20th, armies had begun to notice the cost. World War I saw men collapsing not only from bullets, but from trench foot, a disease caused by prolonged exposure to wet, unsanitary footwear. The muddy, waterlogged trenches of France became breeding grounds for infection. Soldiers wore puttees and rough boots that never dried. Feet rotted. Toes turned black. Commanders saw entire companies reduced to immobility without ever firing a shot. That was the turning point. Armies started to grasp that morale wasn't just about discipline. It was about mobility, and mobility began with functional footwear. The interwar years brought the first serious redesigns. Asymmetrical boots tailored for left and right, hardened toe caps, steel shanks, and replaceable soles. It was no longer acceptable for a boot to be broken in through suffering. Instead, the boot had to serve the foot, not punish it. By World War II, the shift accelerated. American forces introduced the now iconic double-buckle combat boot, designed to keep out debris and water, offering more ankle stability. The British refined their sole patterns for grip. The Germans experimented with hobnailed outsoles, though many of their designs still echoed the harsh rigidity of earlier centuries. Even then, the understanding was growing. A boot wasn't just equipment. It was protection, propulsion, and preservation in one.
Post-war innovation followed civilian trends. Advances in rubber chemistry, synthetic fabrics, and ergonomic design allowed military footwear to improve by leaps. The Vietnam War brought jungle boots. Lightweight with ventilation ports, drainage holes, and fast-drying canvas designed for humid, wet environments. These were no longer one-style-fits-all models. Now terrain dictated the boot. Desert boots for sand, Arctic boots for snow, mountain boots for high-altitude missions. Then came the science. Militaries began working with orthopedists, podiatrists, and biomechanical engineers. Boots were tested in labs and on live terrain. Gait analysis was introduced. Materials like Gore-Tex added breathability without sacrificing waterproofing. Inner soles were redesigned with shock-absorbing foam, gel inserts, and arch support. The sole became a three-layer system: traction outside, cushion in the middle, comfort inside. Lacing systems evolved too, from raw leather to speed lace eyelets and ankle locks, ensuring fit and reducing the chance of rolled ankles. By the 2000s, militaries were issuing region-specific, climate-adapted boots. Special forces wore lightweight tactical models with running shoe flexibility and impact control. Arctic troops received insulated, waterproof boots with built-in moisture control. The global war on terror introduced desert combat boots. Pale, suede-textured, breathable, resistant to heat. Today, soldiers in most advanced armies are issued boots that cost more to develop and test than many older armies spent on full uniforms. Each pair is designed to prevent overuse injuries, support long-distance movement, and reduce fatigue under heavy loads. There are antimicrobial linings, puncture-resistant midsoles, and even boots compatible with biometric sensors and wearable tech. But more importantly, modern doctrine now recognizes that a soldier who walks well fights well. Foot health is monitored. Replacements are available. Break-in time is accounted for. Specialized socks are issued, cushioned, moisture-wicking, reinforced at stress points. Soldiers are taught how to care for their feet, inspect their boots, and report early signs of strain or injury. This shift wasn't just about materials, it was about mindset. Armies finally understood that every successful maneuver begins at ground level. A general's plan is worthless if the troops can't reach the battlefield. A soldier's strength, no matter how elite, crumbles when the body beneath it breaks down from the ground up. So when you look at a modern combat boot, you're not just seeing footwear. You're seeing the long memory of war, of toes lost in Russia, of souls shredded on Spanish roads, of marches halted by blood-soaked socks. You're seeing a quiet revolution that took 200 years to complete. One that began, painfully, with a stiff, symmetrical boot and a soldier too tired to scream. It didn't look like the thing that would break an empire. It was small, ordinary, utilitarian, a shape repeated across thousands of feet, marching in rhythm beneath banners and brass. No one imagined that the downfall of a grand idea, a military genius, a continent-spanning ambition could begin with a boot. And yet, there it was. Not a weapon, not a wound, but a piece of uniform that rubbed, cracked, froze, and failed. A boot that made men limp when they needed to run. A boot that silenced courage with pain. A boot that, in its stubborn silence, helped write the end of one of history's boldest dreams. Napoleon's empire didn't collapse all at once. It thinned, it wore away, it unraveled under the weight of distance and frost, hunger and fatigue. But at the foundation of that unraveling was something visceral and relentless, the loss of mobility, and that loss began at the feet. Soldiers who could no longer walk could no longer fight. Soldiers who couldn't feel their toes couldn't hold formation. Men who stopped to bind their feet with rags or sit for a moment of relief were left behind, first by the march, then by history. The boot, which should have carried them forward, instead ground them down, quietly, consistently, fatally. What makes it tragic is that it didn't have to happen. The boot was not an unavoidable fate. It was a choice made by systems that prioritized image over function, tradition over adaptation, control over compassion. It represented the logic of an age that believed endurance was more noble than efficiency, that suffering built discipline, and that the human body could be reshaped to serve the machine.
And so the boot became more than a garment. It became a symbol of military arrogance, of blind standardization, of leadership too far from the ground to feel what it demanded. It was not the enemy's fire that broke the army, but the cracks in its own foundation. The boot was the quiet saboteur, wearing down muscle and morale step by step, until no spirit remained to carry the banner forward. Today, we remember the silhouette, the tall leather, the rigid shaft, the polished shine beneath the blue coat. It still stands proudly in museums, in paintings, in parades. But that image is hollow. It doesn't creak, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't limp. It doesn't remind us that inside that boot was a foot torn raw, a man dragging himself forward because he had no choice, because his loyalty outran his body. That's the legacy of the Napoleonic boot, not as a relic of glory, but as an indictment. A reminder that the smallest flaws in design can tear through the largest dreams. That one overlooked detail repeated across an army can turn ambition into collapse. History often looks for grand explanations: battles lost, alliances broken, climates turned cruel. But sometimes history turns on the simplest truths. A march cannot continue if the marchers cannot stand. And no empire, no matter how visionary, can outrun its own feet. So the boot stands now not just as part of a uniform, but as a quiet monument to the limits of endurance. Not the noble kind, but the needless. The kind that comes from being ignored by the very system that demanded it. It is the shape of an idea too proud to bend, even when the foot beneath it was breaking. And in that shape, in that stiff, unyielding leather, lies the echo of every step that never reached its destination.